So, tonight we will present two of the films that contributed to the cinematic significance of 1962, alongside such canonical classics as Lawrence of Arabia, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Manchurian Candidate, Gypsy, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and many more, which we will discuss with Stephen and Michael later in the evening. We begin with War Hunt, directed by Dennis Sanders and starring John Saxon, Robert Redford, and Sidney Pollack. The film was produced by Terry Sanders, who is here with us tonight. Terry, can you raise your hand? Where's Terry? Oh, there he is right there. Dennis and Terry are UCLA Film School alums, so I want to thank Terry back to UCLA, and that's also why it makes it especially exciting that tonight's 35mm print of War Hunt is coming from the UCLA collection. So thank you very much, Terry, for coming in. Following War Hunt, I will be joined on stage for a conversation with Stephen and Michael about the films and their book. Then after a brief intermission, we will conclude the evening with a 35mm screening of Ride the High Country, directed by Sam Peckinpah and starring Randolph Scott, Joel McCrea, and Marriott Hartley. If you didn't get a chance to pick up your copy, your signed copy of Cinema 62 in the lobby before the show, we will resume the book signing during the intermission. So please pick up a book and get it signed then if you can. And now please help me welcome to the stage Stephen Farber and Michael McClellan.
Oh, that's such a bright light. I like this.
Well, we can't see it. I'm Stephen.
I'm Michael McClellan, and thanks for coming. We really appreciate it.
And I really want to thank the Film Archive for putting on this program. You know, we were planning to do a lot more programs like this in the spring of 2020, but something happened, and we had to put that off, and we're delighted that the archive was still willing to recognize our film, our book. Last year was the 60th anniversary of these great films, and we're pretty close to that 60th anniversary year, but appreciate those of you who are coming and to hopefully discover some movies. Most people, how many people have not seen War Hunt?
Most
everybody.
Right, yeah.
So, and I'm so thrilled that Terry is here. Also, you know, he really contributed a lot, you know, did like a very thorough interview with him for the book to provide a lot of background information on the movie. We can talk a little bit about that afterwards in our discussion. But it was a very unusual film for 1962, an anti-war film set during the Korean War, which had not been dramatized very often in film, and I think ahead of its time in many ways, as again we'll talk more about that later. And of course it had a great cast as well, and many of the people went on to very important work in film, beginning with the young star of the movie, Robert Redford, in his very first feature film, and the rest of the actors, Sidney Pollack, before he became a Academy Award-winning film director. He was an actor, and he and Redford, I believe, met each other while making this movie and went on to make cinematic history together.
Yes, just some historical context. It's very fitting that you're watching it as part of a double feature, because when it was released in 1962, it was sort of a staggered release. I don't know if Terry can remember this, but it was released in New York in the spring as an art house venue, and then the distributor, United Artists, they decided that they wanted to test it in a few cities as a commercial action war film, which it technically is quasi, and you'll see why. And then when they finally opened it in Los Angeles in November of that year, it was part of a double feature. And another historical reference, 60 years ago on this very date, January the 27th, 1963. You could see it in 2 different theaters in this city, which was very common at the time. There were an enormous number of 1962 films playing all over the city in January of 1963, because in that era, all movie theaters were single screens. There were no multiplexes. So if you think that you're starving to death, the movies are being starved to death, what a cornucopia you would have had 60 years ago.
So we'll say more about this and about other 62 movies in our discussion after the screening. Enjoy.
Yes, thank you.
So we'll all be back up here right after the film. Please turn off all your cell phones, silent all electronic devices, and we are also here to spark conversation about cinema, but please refrain from talking during the film. We'll start the conversation after the film. Okay, with that, thank you very much and enjoy War Hunt. So Stephen Farber is a past president of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association and currently serves as faculty member at UCLA teaching film criticism. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Hollywood, and the Hollywood Reporter. He's also published several books, including Outrageous Conduct, Art, Ego, and the Twilight Zone Case, and Hollywood on the Couch. Michael McClellan is the former senior vice president and head film buyer for Landmark Theaters and served on the Board of Appeals of the Classification and Ratings Administration of the MPAA. He currently co-produces a classic film series in Los Angeles, and they are both the authors of Cinema 62. Please help me welcome to the stage Stephen and Michael.
Grab the seat. Sure, great, thanks.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful book and for joining us here tonight. I definitely want to talk about War Hunt. That was a very powerful experience. I hadn't seen the film before either. And I want to talk about how you first saw it and brought it to the, included it and why you included it in the collection. But let's start with the collection itself. The idea of it and how you came about to write it. As film goers, we're sort of trained by the industry to think about movie seasons. There's the summer season, there's the fall season. Right. The end of the year, critics give us their top 10 list. So we're used to thinking about, movies and movie history in terms of annual increments. In a lot of ways, that's built around industry release schedules. But as a critic and historian, why would a year? What's the significance of studying the specific year? Why would you frame a history in an annual way?
Well, I think you just sort of, in a way, answered the question, because at that time, there wasn't that same kind of seasoned approach to film distribution. I mean, good movies were just released all throughout the year. They weren't so conscious of marketing summer movies of a certain type and awards movies in the fall. I mean, some of the movies that did actually end up in the awards race did come out late in the year, but that was really because that's when they were completed. But there was just the assumption that audiences would go to see interesting, provocative, entertaining movies throughout the year. And that's something that has been lost, I think, today.
Yes, if you think about when the critics, we're in award season right now, right? The Oscar nominations just came out. So, and all these awards in this era now, like there were very few awards in that era. There was no LA Film Critics, National Society of Film, none of that.
SAG, there were no SAG awards.
Right.
No.
So there was the Oscars, there were the Foreign Press, there was the New York Film Circle. That was the only critical circle. And ironically, 1962 was the only year that they didn't give out their awards. And the reason for that was that there was a 100-day newspaper strike in New York, And so they opted not to meet because they couldn't give full consideration. And that also delayed several films from opening in 1962, and they were pushed into 1963. So, having said all that, I just want to read you a list of movies that were on screen on this day 60 years ago in January of 1963. You can find these in the NABES, that's the exhibitor term for neighborhood theaters. War Hunt, as the film you just saw. Any number of these movies, and they were all playing on double bills, not with each other, but the various films. The Miracle Worker, The Manchurian Candidate, Taras Bulba, Hatari, Walk on the Wild Side, Elvis Presley's Girls, 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 Birdman of Alcatraz, George Cukor's directed the Chapman Report, Requiem for a Heavyweight, Period of Adjustment, that was Tennessee Williams' screenplay, starring Jane Fonda, one of the 3 films she made in '62. Walt Disney's In Search of the Castaways, which was a huge hit, by the way. Oh, I'm going to digress. Who went to the movies here tonight in 1962? There you go. That was a big Christmas film. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, The Music Man, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and for you, and this is all in the neighborhoods, by the way, and for the more mature-minded, these are not part of the book, but Satan in High Heels, She Walks by Night, Playgirl After Dark, and The Third Sex. And that was just in the NABES. In the art houses, Antonioni's Eclipse, last year at Marienbad, Boccaccio 70, A Taste of Honey, Divorce Italian Style, Waltz of the Toreadors, Shoot the Piano Player, Electra, and The Sky Above, The Mud Below, which was the Oscar-winning documentary from the previous year. Exclusive engagements, are we ready? To Kill a Mockingbird, Days of Wine and Roses, Phaedra, Long Day's Journey into Night, Gypsy, Freud, Two for the Seesaw, and Jumbo. And the road shows, the big, do you remember what the road shows were? They were reserved seat engagements. We have reserved seats now, but 60 years ago, this was a very big deal. It was a road show, intermissions, grand movie palaces. The Longest Day, which was at the Cathay Circle, which is no longer with us. The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, which was at the Warner Cinerama. That theater's no longer with us. Mutiny on the Bounty at the Egyptian, which is still with us, but they're renovating it. And the crowning achievement of the year, we feel, Lawrence of Arabia at the Warner Beverly Hills. So they were all on screen in this night and this very day in 1963. You don't get that kind of variety these days, folks.
Very good.
But also, speaking to the way the things that were different in 1962, those films would play for weeks on end or months on end in some cases. So if you missed one of these masterpieces one week, you could see it the next month, and it might still be in the theaters.
Sure.
Right, they were circulating around, and many of them, eventually, all of the films that were exclusives, and even the big road shows, they eventually went into the NABES, and then they played on double bills, and they played. Sometimes a movie would be around for almost 2 years in that era. And so that was long before they would be premiering on television. It took them years to wind up on television.
Right.
And then, of course, we don't have all these alternative platforms that we have now.
Yeah, I mean, now a movie opened in the theater 1 week, and 2 weeks later it's gone, and then a week after that it's streaming. It's hard to even get a sense of what's out in the theater at any given time sometimes.
Right.
So you list a lot of these amazing classic films, some films we hadn't heard of. Let's go back to War Hunt, because this is a film that I had discovered reading your book, and I was especially excited that we have a print in the collection. So there's a lot of classics, like canonical classics in the book, but War Hunt is one of the films in the book that really, I think, is overdue for reinspection. I think tonight was a very powerful experience. So let's talk about War Hunt. When did you first see it, and how long did it stay with you, and how did it end up? Why did you decide to include it in the book?
Well, I actually did see it in 1962. I was young, but I was going to a lot of movies, and I did see it, and it got some great reviews. The main critic of the New York Times, Bosley Crowther, raved about it, and he was the most influential critic in the country at that time. And the National Board of Review, which did exist then, and they put it on their 10 best list for the year. So it didn't make a big explosion at the box office, but it got attention, and I was eager to see it again. I hadn't seen it in a long time. I watched it again, and then I contacted Terry to talk about it, and he had some very good memories of. They tried to get cooperation from the Army when they made the movie, but of course the Army was not going to approve a movie like this, which was not exactly a glowing, gung-ho, rah-rah a war movie. It was much more critical, and I personally felt, in kind of looking back at it, that it was really a movie that foreshadowed the Vietnam War era. That, of course, people didn't know that that was going to be such an event in 1962, but the futility of that war, which of course inspired tremendous anti-war protests, I think was kind of foreshadowed in this movie. And the character of Endor that John Saxon played very effectively sort of makes you think of people like Lieutenant Calley in the Vietnam War era, who really became savages during that war experience. So I think there was a lot in it that really speaks to things that were going to happen in the future. That maybe the reason it didn't catch on in a big way is that maybe it was a little too far ahead of its time in raising these anti-war issues and these questions about the psychotic tendencies of some people during a controversial war. And it took a while, I think, seeing it now as you did, I think you appreciate more the incisiveness and the pertinence of what it was saying.
Yeah, I mean, it also, I mean, you talk about a number of different trends throughout the year, different, like, you know, classic Hollywood directors and the directions that their films took. But this falls in the category of new directors and new directions that really did mark 1962 as different. This was a film that represented sort of like an independent voice and a more, I mean, I guess I would say a more risky take in terms of like style and approach to the themes, right? So can you talk about how War Hunt might fit into that theme that you explore in the book in terms of the larger trends of 1962?
Well, I think that, as you say, there were other movies that were kind of mainstream, popular movies that were aimed at like a general audience. But what was so interesting was that there were also these very quirky, adult, provocative, specialized movies that interested people who wanted to go to the movies and see a variety of entertainment. I mean, that actually playing tonight, right at the landmark Nuart Theater, is Stanley Kubrick's film of Lolita, which was another controversial, different kind of movie that played in 1962. So people had a real choice of different kinds of movies that they wanted to see. There were a lot of new talents, like Stanley Kubrick, who was a relatively new filmmaker at that time. The Sanders brothers, who made this movie, also very new people on the scene. And John Frankenheimer, who made The Manchurian Candidate and two other movies in '62. Very talented newcomers that had a lot to offer. But there were also veteran directors like John Ford, Howard Hawks, George Cukor, who you mentioned, who were working that year as well. So there was really such a range of films, and it was very stimulating for people, both who wanted to see more traditional works by old masters and people who wanted to see innovative films by brand new talents on the scene.
Yeah, and this film also represents one of the themes of the book, which is the end of the studio era and the seeds of the new Hollywood, which really came in later after the production code. I mean, that's an interesting. This film and all the films of '62 were all inhibited by the production code, which had been around for 30 years. But the overseas films, that list of the art house examples, were much more frank in their subject matter and in their sexuality. And so a number of producers were really chiding under the production code. And so they were pushing the boundaries, and they modified the production code the previous year. And that allowed a film like Walk on the Wild Side, which I mentioned, to insert. That was Jane Fonda's second film, and that's an example of a new talent with an older golden ager, Barbara Stanwyck, and Barbara Stanwyck's role in that film was as a lesbian madam. Now that had never been seen, and an actress of that stature would have never played a part like that. But this was a pivotal transitional year, and that crossroads of the old Hollywood clashing with the new Hollywood.
Speaking about the code and the censorship, that had eased up a bit since the 1950s. The head of the production code office in I think from the 30s to the 50s, Joe Breen had retired, and he was a real censorious person who strictly interpreted the code. And the people who took over after he left realized that times were changing, and they still were operating under the code, but they were not quite as strict, and there were these changes, as you say, that introduced new subject matter that hadn't been allowed in the past. And I think even a film like War Hunt or A Ride the High Country, which you'll see, had some adult material that wouldn't have been permitted in films even a few years earlier. Now, granted, they would, several years later, even those inhibitions would be gone and the films would be even franker. But it was a transitional period when the old censorship code was beginning to be whittled away a little bit.
What about also on the critical side or the institutional side? I always think this is a pivotal year also because it's kind of the moment when previous decades, film critics, film historians, the idea of film criticism was developing during this time. And there was always the argument, film can be an art. It is an art form, arguing against the idea that it's just pop culture. It doesn't have a value. This is the period of time when filmmakers themselves became conscious of the idea of making art or wanting to make art. MoMA had film programs. There were film classes, film programs starting at universities. So film culture, in a way, became self-conscious of itself around this time, and the filmmakers sort of took that to heart. Does that kind of jives with your theory of this moment of transition?
Oh, definitely. This was the rise of film culture, film being taught in universities. And beyond, UCLA and USC were in the forefront of that, but there was also in New York. But aside from Los Angeles and New York, they were beginning to emerge in different places. There were thousands of local film societies who used to rent out the local theater like 1 or 2 nights a week, and they'd show some of these foreign films that just didn't make it into these smaller towns. And just in popular culture, in 1962, moviegoing was the #1 leisure activity. There was a Gallup poll, and they listed sports events and whatever, summertime
Concerts,
the whole
theater.
thing, theater, exactly. But movie going was number one. And even though the film attendance had been, eroded since with the rise of television in the 40s and the close of theaters, et cetera, there was a rebound in the early 60s. And it was also the golden age of the art houses. All of those, specialized films I was describing, they were at their apex in the early 60s. And it was also, as part of this, and there was the scholarly studies, but also there was a recognition of film as an art, by all means, but also what it represented. Just aesthetically, this was the high point for black and white. That's why we curated these two films tonight. This was in black and white. Ride the High Country is in color, but in 1962, the majority of movies were in black and white. Most of the films that I read to you were in black and white. But within 5 years, they became a tiny minority. So there's a one-word answer for why that happened. Does anyone happen to know it?
Television.
Bingo! Television, exactly. So that pushed the studios, because they all wanted the revenue from the sales of television, and they were told by the television networks and from the manufacturers of televisions that they were switching to color by 1965, so they had better get with it, and they all capitulated, including internationally. All those great, Antonioni, Bergman, Fellini, they loved Kurosawa. They loved working in black and white, but they all had to migrate over to color by the end of the decade.
So I'm going to turn it over to the audience after one question. So, and I'll call on people. Just raise your hand. So you write with one voice in the book, and I'm sure you've had many conversations with people. Why didn't you include this film? Why didn't you include that film? But you write with one voice in the book. But what was your process of working together and coming up with the films, the final selection of films? Did you guys have any arguments about did something you want, Michael, not get in the book? Stephen, did something you want? I mean, how did that process come together?
That's a very good question. For the most part, we worked rather. We deferred to each other's judgment, because I had my favorites and Stephen had his, and that's represented by the book, because I wrote certain. The analysis and the sections on certain films, and Stephen took his, and then we agreed on many of the choices. But we both came from kind of different directions. Stephen had seen a lot of these films originally on the big screen. I hadn't. I'm a little younger, and I hadn't seen. I saw a number of them, but I couldn't go to the adult movies. I didn't see a film like Walk on the Wild Side or Manchurian Candidate or that sort of thing.
Some of the international
films. The international films, I didn't see any of those in 1962. It was years later in film classes and universities and television and in rep houses when I went into the industry. So, and I'd never seen War Hunt before, so we watched it originally on television. I'm seeing it for the first time tonight. And I just want to give a shout out to the cinematographer, Ted McCord, who worked beautifully in black and white. In fact, most of his really top work is in black and white. He was 60 years old in 1962, and this is represented. He was Oscar nominated for another movie that was playing. Actually, I didn't mention that. Yes, I did. Two for the Seesaw. And that's another little hidden gem. It's a play adaptation, but his black and white cinematography is breathtaking. It's exquisite. What he was doing because it's a play, so there's mostly interiors of rooms, but just look at that movie and see what he was doing with lighting and shadows. It's incredible. So anyway.
He also shot The Sound of Music, didn't he?
Well, that was his big film,
Yeah,
with The Sound of Music. So so they were very versatile, but they were all making the a number of the cinematographers did work in both both foremost. Ernest Haller, who won an Oscar for Gone with the Wind, he shot Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and he got an Oscar nomination for it. And that's an exquisitely shot film as well.
So, Stephen, were there any titles that you, I mean, in terms of the working process, is that kind of how it went down?
Well, I mean, we went over the whole list of movies that came out in '62. We couldn't even cover every single one. There are some other interesting movies that are just like mentioned in the appendix to the book, but not written about at length, because there was such a treasure trove that we couldn't cover everything in the detail that we would have liked. But yeah, I mean, I think, we certainly agreed on all of the important movies to be included. We may not have shared the same enthusiasm for every single movie, but we agreed that all of the movies that are covered in the book were important films that needed to be addressed and discussed.
But definitely in the sum total makes 62 the most significant year. Obviously, that was the point of agreement that brought you two together. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So let's turn it over to the audience. Any questions? Go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call you. We'll bring a mic down to you, so just wait for the mic to come up. Any questions from the audience? We're in the back row here on this side. We're going to bring a mic to you.
Yes, thank you. A couple questions for the filmmaker. Is he still here?
Terry's right down here.
Yeah, could I ask? Two questions. Had you seen...
Can we bring a mic to Terry as well, down here in the front? Sorry, so go ahead and ask your question.
Had you seen Redford in Sidney Lumet's TV adaptation of Iceman Cometh before you cast him in this? And what was it like shooting in Topanga Canyon?
In making this film, United Artists needed one name actor, and that was John Saxon that we got on loan out from Universal. And Redford was, we hadn't heard
Terry,
of him at
can
all.
you hold the mic closer to your
Yeah,
mouth? Yeah, thank you.
we hadn't heard of him, but Monique James, who was an agent at MCA, recommended him because she had seen him in a few TV things, and we actually cast him because we saw a TV show that he was rather good in. What was the question, though?
Topanga Canyon. What was it like?
Oh, Topanga Canyon. Well, the film being extremely low, modest budget, I would have loved to have gone to Korea to film, but that was out of the question. And so many chance things happen to make in any film, and the good thing that happened for us, and not for the people in Topanga Canyon, there was a huge fire there, like a year before, and so you got a lot of burned foliage, and it just looked like a kind of war zone. And scouting is a big part of making any film, and so we scouted and decided that this was would work.
Hey, thank you very much. So we have time for a couple more questions. I don't mean to cut you off, Terry, but we have time for a couple more questions, or one more question. If there's one more question over here on the side.
Here.
We'll bring the mic back over here on the aisle here. Thank you. Thank you, Terry.
Hi, I just have a question. There's not many Korean movie, the war movie back then, But there's another movie that I was really impressed. It was back, I don't know if you gentlemen see this movie. It's called 1951. It's called The Steel Helmet. Yeah, it's very similar to this too as well.
Right.
Yeah. Beside these two films, I really like your film too. Very, very, beautiful done. Is any other Korean movie like this?
You mean set in Korea?
Yes.
About
Yeah,
the Korean War.
Yeah. There's
Pork Chop Hill.
Pork Chop Hill in
Pork Chop Hill,
1959.
yes.
Gregory Peck.
Right.
Right. He was also the producer and the star of that.
In '62, I mean, the war film genre in general, was World War II still the focus?
Still the main.
Oh, that was the main
focus. That's why I think this film stood out
Yeah,
because
it
it
did,
really
because- right.
had a different setting. Because there were a number of Second World War movies that were still being made that year. In fact, Daryl Zanuck's production of The Longest Day about D-Day was the most successful film made during that year. It was later surpassed by Lawrence of Arabia, but Lawrence of Arabia did not come out until the very end of the year in December. So earlier in the year, The Longest Day had reigned as the top box office champ, and that was the ultimate World War II movie.
So we have time for one more question right here in the middle. Let's bring the mic over to you. Sorry. Okay, we're right behind you on the side there. We always sneak up on you.
It was very interesting to see the North Koreans saying Wall Street, wants you to keep going with the war, like today, But so it was very poignant in his comment. And then Robert Redford said, "What do you think of AT&T when he first got off?" Showing that he was kind of a glib, a semi-affluent kind of kid, and so. The politics of the movie was very subdued, though. It was just those couple things. Otherwise, it was these poor guys stuck in the middle of a war. But it was very unpretentious and credible. I really liked it.
Thank you.
So we can wrap up, but I want to ask. So just finally, because the peak of 1962 for you is Lawrence of Arabia. You could probably go on and on for that, but was that just the obvious choice for you? And if you could briefly summarize what makes that the top film of this year of amazing films, I think.
Well, I mean, first of all, it was a remarkable spectacle. It was shot over a period of a full year, basically, on location. No CGI effects there. It was really done in these remote areas of the desert in Jordan, mainly. And I don't think there's any substitute that a computer can quite match the authenticity of those locations. Beautifully filmed, of course, by the cinematographer and the director, David Lean. Beyond that, though, it had a script with psychological depth and complexity that you saw in quite a few other movies of 1962, but I would say the peak of that was in this epic film that you had a character at the center who was not a traditional hero. I mean, he did perform some heroic, courageous acts, but he was a very complicated, tortured character, and the idea of putting a character like that at the center of an expensive, epic movie was really bold, but I think because David Lean had won an Academy Award for his last film, The Bridge on the River Kwai, the studio and the people who were financing the movie were willing to go along with what he wanted to do. So I think it's a movie that works on so many levels as a grand epic in the tradition that we saw sometimes in that era, but we don't see it as often anymore, coupled with psychological depth that was really characteristic of more of the small art films of the era. So it really had like the best of both worlds, I would say.
I'm going to beg your apology because I almost forgot we have a second film tonight. Could you say a few words about Ride the High Country and why it made the list?
Well, I mean, this is another movie that is talking about some psychological complexity. You'll see it in that movie as well. And this was another new filmmaker, Sam Peckinpah. It was his second movie only. People didn't really know much about him or who he was. So it introduced a brand new talent, as we saw in War Hunt, in terms of the filmmaking and the casting. And Ride the High Country, of course, had two veteran actors, Randolph Scott and Joel McCrea, but it also had a brand new actress, Mariette Hartley, like Mr. Redford in War Hunt. I mean, Mariette Hartley didn't have quite the same career going forward that Robert Redford did, but she was a new discovery as well. And that's another thing that made 62 interesting, was it mixed brand new talents and veteran actors with tremendous experience. And it had a little more kind of sexual boldness, as you'll see, that wasn't characteristic of censored movies in 1962.
You said it. You said it all.
So we're going to take a 10-minute intermission. Stephen and Michael will be back out in the lobby signing books.
If anyone hasn't bought it, please do.
Yes. And we'll be right back with Ride the High Country. Thank you so much.